Good evening all, and welcome. Something a little bit different tonight. A question you might have pondered listening to the countless ghost stories I've shared over the years. Is there life after death? If so, what could it be? Well, tonight I have a collection of stories from people who have nearly passed on or been in the presence of those who have. It's a rather interesting collection if I say so myself, and I hope it leaves you thinking. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Years ago, I worked in a facility that provided assisted living services as well as hospice care for people who had become disabled due to HIV/AIDS. Too many stories to count, but the most potent and most undeniable one for me was a resident I'll call Paul, and a fellow CRMA called Bert. Paul was in his 60s and had been with us for years, one of those people who came close to death many times only to bounce back. His health was always awful. He just kept hanging in there against all odds. He was finally ready to die, not actively trying to push it along, but he talked about dying in that comfortable way people who are at peace with their impending death start to do. One day he was just chatting with Bert, myself, and some others about the existence of an afterlife, who Paul adored in particular among the staff. Semi-seriously said he'd appreciate it if when the time came, Paul would visit him and prove that life after death exists. Paul laughed and promised he would do his best. They revisited the conversation many times, mostly in a kind of jokey way. "Now, Paul, if you die this weekend, don't forget to stop by and let me know." Or, "Bert, if you don't get those cookies I like, I might have to visit someone instead if I die." Basic end-of-life gallows humor stuff. Then it happened. Paul passed away peacefully late one night and was discovered by a CRMA at 6 a.m. when they brought him his morning meds. When Bert came into work that morning, maybe 5 minutes after I did, he didn't even take off his coat before asking, "Paul died last night, right, didn't he? Around 2 a.m., to be clear?" Bert was one of the most honest, grounded, and no-nonsense people I'd ever met. He was also more or less an atheist. He said he had woken up from a dead sleep around 2 in the morning to find a green orb floating above him. He became overwhelmed with a sense of peace and good humor, and just knew it was Paul. He told me he thanked Paul for everything and said goodbye, and fell back asleep immediately and without any effort or intent. When he woke up, he briefly considered that it might have been a dream, but it had felt so unbelievably real, he just knew it hadn't been. That experience changed Bert. He'd always been a great person, but he became even more compassionate, warm, and non-judgmental, as well as genuinely spiritual for the first time in his life. He never doubted what he experienced, nor did the rest of us, even if I hadn't completely trusted Bert's integrity, which I did. There was no other logical explanation for what happened. I still questioned the meaning of life and the nature of reality and all that on a regular basis, but I've never doubted the existence of some form of afterlife since that day. The evidence I can offer for the existence of the afterlife is this. When our daughter Abigail was just 3 or 4 years old, she caught us completely off guard with a single innocent question. "Can you buy some boy toys for Max?" We almost fell over in shock. Abigail had no way of knowing, but she was the surviving twin of a pregnancy that had ended in a miscarriage. She had been born, but her non-identical twin had not. And the most unsettling part, the name we had chosen for him had the pregnancy gone to term, was Max. We hadn't told anyone, not friends, not extended family, and certainly not our children. It wasn't something we thought a young child needed to know or try to understand. There she was, completely unprompted, asking us to buy toys for the brother she was never told existed. Trying to make sense of what we're hearing, we ask her, "How old is Max? When's his birthday?" Abigail frowned, looking almost frustrated, as if she couldn't believe we didn't already know. "He's the same age as me," she said with complete certainty. "His birthday is the same day as mine." That moment changed everything for us. There had already been times when we'd hear Abigail laughing and chatting away in her nursery, hosting tea parties with unseen guests. She was the only child at home during those times. Her older siblings were at school, and looking back, we had absolutely no doubt she was playing with her twin brother. We took her to pick out some toys for Max, and she chose a wooden train set along with a few other small things. Those toys are now carefully packed away, cherished reminders of the life-changing experience that reshaped our understanding of the spirit world. For a few years, the playtimes continued. Abigail would talk and giggle as though she were playing with someone only she could see, and then just one day they stopped. There was no distress, no confusion, just a quiet acceptance, as though Max had told her it was time for him to leave. Abigail is now 12, a beautiful and bright young girl, and I have no doubt that her twin Max is still there watching over her. And one thing I believe with all my heart is that when our time in this world comes to an end, Max will be there, waiting for us, his parents and his siblings. Until then, rest in peace, my darling Max. This happened to me back in the 80s, several months after my father had passed away. At the time, I was an armed officer with the Metropolitan Police, stationed at an event near the BBC in Portland Place, W1. I was standing on guard scanning the crowd, when an elderly lady approached me, pushing a shopping trolley behind her. She stopped right in front of me, looked up and asked, "Is your name Roger?" Now, Roger was a family nickname my dad had given me, but I didn't recognize this woman at all. My heart skipped a beat as I replied, "Sorry, do I know you?" She looked at me with a strange, knowing gaze and said, "You're gonna think I'm mad, but I'm a medium and I have a message from your dad." At that point, I was completely thrown off and still processing the idea of someone claiming to have a message from the other side, and my skepticism kicked in. But she wasn't done. She continued, "I was just shopping in C&A on Oxford Street when your dad came to me. He asked me to pass a message on to the policeman standing near the BBC." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I stayed quiet as she went on. "Your dad's a big man with very broad shoulders. He's built like a wrestler with short grey hair, a Roman nose, and looks just like Burt Lancaster from the movies." The description she gave was so precise, so eerily accurate, that I felt the air around me grow heavy. My dad had been built exactly like that. It was as if she was seeing him through some otherworldly lens. The woman paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "He wants you to know that he's out of pain. He suffered a lot with lung cancer before he passed. He's with his mum and dad and his dogs. He's very happy now. He wants you to know to look after your mum, and he loves you very much." I was in shock. I hadn't spoken to anyone about my dad's struggles with cancer, and yet this woman was telling me details that she couldn't possibly have known. There was no way she could have known the way he looked or the pain he had endured. I felt tears welling up but swallowed them down, my voice thick when I spoke. "Thank you." I was unsure what else to say. My heart was throbbing in my chest. Before she left, I made sure she had a comfortable ride back to her East End home, sending her off in the luxury of a black cab, with my thanks and love. I'll never forget that moment, nor the strange, comforting sense of peace it gave me. It felt like a sign that my dad had somehow found a way to reach out from the other side, to let me know he was okay, and that he was still watching over me. A few days before my father died, he said he had been talking to his dead brother when I went to see him. I thought, oh no, it's getting to be that time. On the day of his death, he was sitting upright in bed with both my mum and me holding each of his hands. He was unconscious, his head leaning back. Suddenly he opened his eyes and had a look on his face as if to say, "What the hell are you all doing here?" while staring at the ceiling or wall. He died minutes later. Both my mother and I said, they came for him. His family came for him. This was the last gift my father left me. Don't be afraid of death. If you believe your family will come for you too, it's only the end of the beginning. I also have another story to share. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was dying in hospital. My father arrived, and it was just the four of us in the room, with Grams in bed. My mum and I went down to the cafe to get a meal, and returned to find my father sitting in the lobby by the elevators. We asked him why he was sitting there, and he said, "There's no room for me there. They're all there." Mum and I ran in to find my grandma taking her last breaths. She had a DNR, so we simply called the front desk and asked them to send a nurse, but she was gone. Later, my father explained to my mother and me why he'd left the room. He said he saw my grandfather, two great aunts, and a family friend standing around the bed. My grandfather holding my grandma's feet, waiting for her. My dad had the ability to see sometimes, but he couldn't bear to look at the dead relatives waiting for another to pass, so he left the room. They came and got her too. My father was a very sensitive and special person. He was pragmatic and not one to talk about such things happening to him, because he knew people would think he was crazy. There is so much we don't know, and so little that we do. I myself am a medical empath, and also a registered nurse, and I've seen some stuff. I have died twice. The first time was in a serious car accident. It was a blinding white light. It was pure love and nothing mattered anymore, just total peace. I was pronounced dead by EMTs. Then I heard someone yell that they're getting a faint pulse and to get the medevac here now. I was fighting to stay in the light, but a voice told me it wasn't my time and that I was needed. The second time was during open heart surgery. I was in a heart/lung machine, and when I woke up after the surgery, a young male nurse would often hold my hand, telling me to hang on tight. I told him the breathing tube hurt, and I wanted it taken out. He said hang on for 1 more hour and then we'll see, and that I was almost there. I practiced my sign language with him, and I later found out there was no male nurse, and I certainly couldn't have been talking because I had a breathing tube in, and my hands were by my sides the entire time and bound by the tight bed sheets. They do this so you don't accidentally start pulling your breathing tubes out when you begin waking up. 2 days after I got out of the ICU, I swear I saw an angel. You could see in my hospital room, and she chased a dark shadow out. And after the open heart surgery, my husband brought me home from the hospital. It was just before Thanksgiving, and he gets me situated on the sofa before leaving for the groceries. I'm laying down on the sofa but can see our patio. The patio door is the main door that we use since the garage is just past it. I fell asleep. Later I'm waking up and I hear 2 males in the kitchen talking about me. I'm not alarmed. I'm oddly comforted knowing they're there looking after me. As I become more awake, I hear one of the guys say, "He's home now. She'll be okay." And the other replies, "We can go now. He's here." And I see my husband at the patio door opening to come inside with the groceries. Guardian angels, ghosts, relatives who have passed on, I don't have a clue. All I know is I felt so much comfort knowing they were watching out for me. The open heart surgery was in 2011, but occasionally I still have paranormal experiences. My heart buddy had the same operation 6 months prior to me. He was dying. He had endocarditis and was rapidly dying. He was in the basement of the hospital having an echocardiogram, which is what showed them that he had endocarditis. He's in the hallway on a gurney waiting to be taken back to his room when a man walks by, glances at him and does a double take. It was one of his fraternity brothers that he hadn't seen in 10 years. He tells Jerry to call Dr. Pollock and tell him that he wants him to do the surgery. Jerry didn't even know he needed surgery at that point, but he agrees and his friend leaves. The cardiologist comes into Jerry's room, and as soon as he gets back from the testing, he tells him they need to operate as soon as possible, and that he needs to pick a surgeon. I can recommend Dr. Pollock. Jerry says Dr. Pollock, and it turns out Dr. Pollock had a cancellation, so they did the operation the very next morning. But that night before the operation, Jerry's deceased father came into the room and told him it was going to be okay and not to worry. And Jerry made it through the surgery and recovered with flying colors. He's telling Dr. Pollock later about his fraternity brother recommending him. He tells him the fraternity brother's name, and Dr. Pollock gets a strange look on his face. He then tells Jerry that Brad had died 5 years ago in a car accident. One Tuesday night last January, I was sitting on the couch when I felt a really strong presence next to me. It was so intense I looked up because I fully expected to see someone standing there, but there was no one there. My father came to mind. It just felt like him. It was unsettling, but I tried to put it out of my mind. I'm sensitive to things like this, and didn't want to even consider it could be my dad in spirit. About a minute later, my cat, who was on the windowsill next to me, looked up suddenly and fixed her gaze intently on something. I looked to see if there was a bug or anything novel that caught her attention, but there was nothing. Now, this is a very friendly and non-skittish cat. A stranger can walk into the house and she doesn't run and hide, and after about 10 seconds of her eyes tracking something, she darts under the couch. She's never once done this. I kneeled on the ground to check on her, and out of the corner of my eye I saw someone walking by and just assumed it was my child. I started talking to them about how weird the cat was acting. Then I looked up, and there was no one there. I could hear my kid playing computer games in the other room. I found out Saturday that my dad was found dead in his bed after his friends called in on a wellness check. No one had heard from him in days. The coroner said he died a few days earlier. We were a bit estranged, so we hadn't been in touch. I'm convinced that he died on Tuesday. That was the day he came by. He was an imposing man, which could explain why my cat was so rattled. I spoke to a medium a few weeks later, and he shared specific details about not only my dad, but a friend of his who had been visiting in spirit because his health was failing. The medium said his friend likely didn't have much long either. That friend passed away about a month later, and while we were on the video call, the medium's phone was knocked down twice. It didn't fall. He said it was knocked out of the holder. He explained that my dad didn't like that we were doing this, which tracks because he didn't believe in psychics and was actually atheist. So apparently even atheists can persist after death. I didn't tell the medium anything about my father or the nature of his passing, only that he had passed. Interestingly, the medium said that Dad was in bed and woke up with a sharp pain in his chest and knew it was the end. He was able to basically push himself out of his body before he felt any more pain. The coroner said he had a heart attack. The medium didn't know this. I've heard in near-death experience accounts that people can do something like this, draw out before they really suffer. It's reassuring to know. I don't think the medium was just trying to appease me. It wasn't his style. Even knowing that we live on doesn't fully take away the pain of the loss, but it is comforting to believe that this thing called consciousness is bigger than the body and transcends matter. I don't think the afterlife is all heaven or brimstone and fire. It seems much more nuanced and intriguing than that. I was briefly a hospice caretaker, and my client, who was nearing the end of her life, would often tell me to watch out for the ladies surrounding her. She couldn't see them, but she spoke of them often, as though they would just be on the veil waiting. I couldn't see them myself, but I felt their presence in the air, heavy yet somehow comforting, as if they were there to guide her, just as I would later feel guided by something beyond the physical world when my father entered hospice a few years later. He too would call out to the loved ones who had passed, voices only he would hear, whispering to them from somewhere unseen. He had a certain calm about him in those last days, as if he had already made peace with whatever awaited him. One night, I asked him how I would know he was with me once he was gone, and after a long silence he looked at me with a glint in his eye, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his lips, and said, You'll be surrounded by Tweety birds. You'll see them everywhere." Tweety birds? It was a nickname I hadn't heard in years, one he'd given me as a child. It was a strange thing to say, but it made my heart feel lighter somehow. The day after he passed, I found a single yellow feather on my car. I remember staring at it for what felt like an eternity. What was so unsettling about it wasn't just the color, but the fact that yellow birds, Tweety birds, weren't a common sight where we lived. We didn't have those type of birds in our area, yet there was an unmistakable sign that my dad's presence was still lingering just out of sight, but not far. Over the weeks that followed, I started to find more feathers on my front porch, on my doorstep, even in the driveway, all of them yellow. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, almost as though he was leaving me a breadcrumb trail, guiding me through my grief. The dreams started soon after, and one in particular stands out in my mind. It was vivid, so real that I could swear I could feel the warmth of my father-in-law's embrace as he visited me in the dream. He had passed shortly after my own father, and though I hadn't expected him to reach out so soon, there he was. He was sitting at the kitchen table, smiling, talking about things no one else would know, his eyes twinkling with mischief, as though he had returned for a brief moment to remind me he was still watching over us. It felt so real that when I woke up I could almost hear the sound of his voice still echoing in my ears. And then there was the dog. Our soul dog, our beloved companion who had been by our side through thick and thin, who had passed away in early December. She was only 6 when her life was cut tragically short by liver failure, and we had to make the agonizing decision to let her go. We held her as she took her last breath, and something in the room shifted. It was as if the energy in the space thickened, and a quiet stillness settled over us, as though she was slipping into something beyond. Her absence left a hollow ache that I didn't know how to fill. A little while after her passing, I came across a post about a litter of puppies who were somehow related to her in a strange, almost inexplicable way. We had gone to meet them hoping to find a chocolate-colored pup, but instead ended up with a black one that looked just like her. The resemblance was uncanny, and though we hadn't planned on getting another dog so soon, it felt as if she had known exactly what I needed. This new puppy, sweet and gentle, seemed to have her spirit in her eyes, and I swear there are times when she looks at me as though she knows how much I miss our old girl. And then something even more unexplainable began to happen. From the moment our dog passed, my backyard began to fill with cardinals, dozens of them, sometimes more. At first it was just 1 or 2, but soon it became an overwhelming number. There were days when I'd step outside and the air would be alive with their fluttering wings, their crimson feathers a stark contrast against the snow-covered ground. But what made it even more eerie was how they would always gather near the spot where I would play ball with our dog in the afternoons. One cardinal in particular would sit there always in the same spot watching me, as if it were keeping vigil. It was as though our dog's spirit was using the birds to communicate, to show me that she was still with me in some strange, unearthly way. I don't have the answers to any of it, but in those quiet moments when the wind stirs the trees and the cardinals gather, I feel the presence of my father, father-in-law, and our beloved dog, just beyond the veil. Maybe they're not gone after all. Perhaps they're closer than we think. When I was around 11, I attended my first funeral with my parents. I had never seen a dead body before, and the sight of it shook me to my core. From that moment on, the thought of death terrified me, and it became a lingering shadow in my life. But everything changed when I sat with my mother in her final moments. Watching whatever she experienced in those last breaths shattered my fear completely. It was as if she had one foot in this world and in the other, and whatever she saw was wonderful. I know now without a doubt that death isn't the end. As she approached the threshold, I sat nearby, holding her hand, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her gaze drifted past me, locking onto something in the far corner of the room. Her entire expression transformed her face, once tired and worn, now lit up with pure, uncontainable joy. It wasn't just peace, it was excitement, as if she was greeting a loved one she hadn't seen in years. Her eyes tracked something invisible, following it as it moved across the room towards her. I swear by the way she was looking, whatever it was had come up right beside her. Then as suddenly as it had started, she closed her eyes. A deep rattling breath shuddered through her chest, the unmistakable sound of the death rattle. I sat there barely breathing myself, and 2 minutes later she exhaled one final time and was gone. But I didn't believe she died in that last breath. I believed she had already left when her eyes closed, that her mother and sister long past had come for her, and her soul had gone with them. Her body simply took those final 2 minutes to catch up. I used to fear death more than anything, but when I saw that look on her face, pure childlike enthusiasm, I knew deep in my heart and soul that there's something waiting for us beyond this life. And I'm positive it is beautiful. I overdosed once. When I came to, I wasn't in my body. I was standing in the middle of the street right at the stop sign. Everything around me felt different. There was a low hum behind me, like a distant room full of pleasant conversation, voices blending together in a calm, rhythmic murmur. The air was warm, wrapping around me like a soft embrace, and I could feel the peace radiating from whatever was behind me. But as I turned my head, I saw something that stopped me cold. At the end of the road, my friend was bent over someone lying motionless on the pavement. And then I realized it was me. Before I could react, I felt a presence close to me, a voice low and firm that whispered in my ear, "You have two choices. Stay here and get it together, or leave and hope for the best for your kids." In that instant, everything snapped back in place. My body jolted and I shot up, gasping for air. I puked. I was back. That was 12 years ago. I've been sober ever since, and my boy, the one I almost left behind, turns 13 in a few months. Since that experience, I've lost many people, but death feels different to me now. I no longer fear where they've gone because I know they're somewhere warm, somewhere full of voices and peace. The memories of your loved ones are always a blessing, and I hope in some way my story helps others find peace. My dad had asked me to come with him to the final meeting with the church pastor before my mum's memorial service. It felt like an odd thing to do, but he insisted. I had already chosen the Gospel and New Testament readings: John 11, Jesus wept; 1 John 4, God is love, and perfect love drives out fear. It was a strange comfort to find these passages, given how suddenly and unexpectedly my mother had passed away. There had been no goodbyes, no chance to say anything I needed to say. The loss had come without warning, like a cruel, cold wind sweeping through. You see, when I was just 3, my mother had undergone open brain surgery to remove a golf ball-sized tumor from the front of her brain. The surgery was successful, but it left her with lasting brain damage. From that point on, she lived in a prison of her own mind, overcome by OCD symptoms, riddled with anxiety and always in fear. Her mind was a constant storm that she couldn't escape. I remember vividly how each night she would spend an hour locking and checking the doors, making sure everything was in its place, even though I was far too young to fully understand what was happening. On that day in the pastor's office, my dad and I sat there preparing for what was to come. The pastor spoke first, telling us he had chosen a psalm for the service. It was Psalm 30. You turned my wailing into dancing. I didn't recognize it, and in the haze of grief, I wasn't particularly invested in what he was saying. I had to keep my distance, keep the emotions from spilling over, as I couldn't afford to let myself break down, not in front of Dad, and certainly not in front of the pastor. Then the pastor said something that made my chest tighten. He told us, "I believe that right now your mother is with God. She's no longer experiencing any of the mental limitations she suffered with in life." As soon as he spoke those words, something shifted. It wasn't just a shift in the air. It was like the world itself had slowed, or maybe even stopped. Everything around me blurred. I felt this overwhelming heaviness, but at the same time I was utterly relaxed, as if the weight of the world had been lifted. A warmth, a liquid warmth moved through my body, starting deep at my core and spreading outward. The air around me became thick and soupy, almost tangible, and I felt I was being wrapped and embraced by it. It was a shockingly surreal experience. I tried my best to remain composed, not wanting to reveal what was happening to my dad or the pastor. For a few seconds I felt an immense sense of peace. It was the deepest peace I had ever known, free from anxiety, fear, pain, or sorrow. I was surrounded by a presence that was beyond words, something so massive and pure that it almost felt as though the room itself was not large enough to contain it. In that moment, an unmistakable thought filled my mind, so clear that it felt like it was being whispered directly into my soul. "I'm okay. I'm with God." I don't know if it was my mother speaking or the Lord himself, but the message didn't matter. It was the feeling, the unmistakable certainty that she was at peace, no longer trapped in the fear and torment that had defined her life. I felt the weight of her suffering lift off her spirit, and for a brief moment, I got to experience a fraction of the peace she was now living in. Then as quickly as it came, it was over. The room returned to normal, the pastor was still talking and I was sitting in his chair, and my dad hadn't seemed to notice a thing. It was as though the veil between this world and the next had lifted for just a moment, and just enough for me to feel the warmth of her presence. The way my mother died had been agonizing. She had suffered alone, likely in immense pain for hours before passing. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. A mother who had endured so much her entire life, now facing her final moments without anyone by her side. But the experience in that pastor's office brought me a peace that I hadn't expected. I knew with every part of my being that she was no longer in pain, that she was no longer bound by the suffering that had plagued her in life. I thanked God for the gift of that moment. The pastor's words had been verified in ways that I couldn't explain. God truly had turned her wailing into dancing. And in that brief, sacred moment, I felt the undeniable truth that the afterlife was real and that my mother was there, at peace and free from her earthly struggles. When I was around 6 to 7 years old, we moved into a new house. One night I woke up and went to my parents' room, where I saw someone standing by the wardrobe looking at my photo. I thought it was my mother, so I quietly called out, "Mom, Mom." Then I turned to my right, where my parents' bed was, and saw that both my mum and dad were sleeping there. When I looked more closely at the figure staring at my picture, I noticed they were wearing a nightgown with purple flowers on it, and had strange hair, very similar to my grandma's hair who had recently passed away. I was crying so hard that my dad had to escort me out of her funeral ceremony. The next morning I told my parents what happened, and they were a bit shocked to say the least. But this is the experience that has stuck with me the most, and made me believe in the afterlife and other paranormal things. When I was just 2 years old, I died. I fell into an above-ground pool, and the water, thankfully, was very cold. My mum found me shortly after floating, and in her panic, she thought I was just a blue towel. But when she realized what was happening, she grabbed me and ran, slamming into the screen door in her haste. In that frantic moment, I slipped from her grasp, and my brother, who had been watching Fat Albert in the other room, vividly remembers seeing his lifeless sister roll into the living room. He says he watched in horror as my mother screamed out to God, begging him not to take me that day. My mum was a nurse, and at the time she had just completed a CPR course. But in that moment, fear completely paralyzed her. She was frozen, unable to act. Then, as she later described, she felt a warm embrace around her, a presence that whispered into her ear, "You know what to do, Sarah." To this day, she believes it was the Lord who guided her, reminding her of the life-saving knowledge she already had. My dad, in desperation, called 911, but my mum didn't wait. She gave me mouth-to-mouth, even though my jaw had frozen shut from the cold water. Miraculously, I woke up, but the battle wasn't over. I was rushed to the hospital by air after my dad insisted that waiting for an ambulance was not an option. At the hospital, my doctors had to carefully warm my body to avoid any damage. I don't have memories of what happened after that, but my first memory upon waking up was of my grandma. She was the first person I saw standing by my mum, and in the haze of everything, the first words out of my mouth were, "She hugged me, Mummy." I still don't know who she was, but my mum believes it was someone looking out for me, keeping me safe in that dark moment. I've often thought that it might have been my grandmother who passed away when my dad was just a little boy. She took her own life, and perhaps in some way, she was the one who kept me safe that day. Whoever it was, I know I was held in the arms of something beyond this world, and it was a comfort I carry with me. I don't fear what happened that day. If anything, I feel a sense of peace, as though I was protected during that darkness, and I've always believed that someone was watching over me, guiding me back. When I was in high school, I worked as a courtesy clerk at Albertsons. People were always telling me that they saw me somewhere in town when I wasn't there. Well, one day when I got out of class at the end of school, I had to go straight to work. I wouldn't get home until just after 9 that night, so I walked in after 9 and said, "Hi people," to my mum and my sisters. They all looked confused. My mum asked me where I was coming from. I said I had been at work. My mum and my older sister both said, "No, you haven't. You came in hours ago, said hi people and went upstairs." I said I didn't. I hadn't been home since I left at 7 a.m. So all 4 of us went upstairs to my room to see who came home. My door, which I usually leave open, was closed. The light was on, as was the TV. We opened the door, but no one was there. But it gets weirder. In high school, we had a secondary school called the Skill Center. It was a place that had a collection of vocational classes you could take. For instance, I took TV broadcasting, web design, and forestry. One day I was waiting for the bus to leave the Skill Center after my broadcasting class, and a teacher I had never met ran up to me and said, "Hey, you need to come back to class." I'd never stepped foot in it, but apparently I had been missing for the last few seasons. I tried to explain that I wasn't in it, but she did seem to know who I was. So she took me to the office thinking I was ditching. We go in and I tell the office clerk my name. She looks me up and sure enough I'm in broadcasting just like I said. But I'm also registered to her class with my stepdad's last name. I went by both names, but it was a bit confusing, but both names are relatively unique. So it's not like there could have been a random person that looks just like me in her class. It's extremely unlikely. I had been in her class for the entire semester apparently, until I suddenly stopped showing up. I had turned in work and everything, even had my goddamn signature on it. One day this doppelganger simply stopped showing up, and no one ever saw them again, and I have no explanation for it. I was a skeptic and an atheist in the afterlife before this happened. So my mother and I had a close bond. She and I were very close, and we often talked about the spirit world. Neither of us knew if anything exists beyond the physical world, and had had no paranormal experiences before, but we loved talking about the idea. 6 months ago, I took her out to dinner, and we once again got talking about life and death. She promised that when she died, she would reach out to me if that was something that was even possible, and we set up a secret code word only we knew. We promised we'd see a medium after each one of us died and see if they got it right. This wasn't documented anywhere. It was a private conversation between two people in a car. Fast forward 4 months and my dear mother passed away. She wasn't even sick. Here 1 second, gone the next. Obviously this had been very difficult for me and my family, and I'd been assisting my father while settling her affairs. This whole time I'm looking out for some sign that she's still there. Nothing at all happened for well over a month until January. It was around 6 p.m. I was upstairs playing video games, feeling normal, and I got this really weird sensation like I'm being watched. Not in a scary way, just to be clear. Just felt like someone was nearby. There was also a fuzzy feeling in my hand, an overall feeling of being in an altered state somehow. I needed to get started on making dinner, so I head downstairs and my fiancé is down there reading a book. On my way to the kitchen, I say, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but do you feel like Mum is here with us right now?" Before she can even answer, I get this overwhelmingly positive feeling throughout my whole body. Shivers start on the back of my neck and it's like some energy was flowing throughout my whole body. I later described it as a full-body panic attack, but replaced all the negative feelings of a panic attack with good positive ones. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was absolutely anomalous in every way. The whole time my feet are planted in one spot, and I'm locking eyes with my fiancé and basically saying, "The hell is this?" over and over again. And at one point I noticed my fiancé squint her eyes and cock her head, but I was a little too distracted to ask what was up. This sensation lasted for about 20 seconds before I began to cry pretty hard. I was crying for the loss of my mum, but also from the joy because deep down I knew that what I was feeling was my mum. After I began to cry, my fiancé sat me down on the couch and held me for a bit until I felt normal. This is the part where I say that I'm a naturally skeptical person, maybe too much so, and that I definitely would have dismissed this whole experience as a psychological thing if it hadn't have been for what my fiancé said while next to me. She said that while this was happening and that we were locking eyes, for a brief moment, she saw a woman's forehead directly behind me. She said she saw it, looked away, looked back, and it was still there before disappearing for good. What I found interesting is that my fiancé is the biggest scaredy cat about literally anything, and despite that, she said she wasn't frightened by what she saw. She said she felt a sense of calm and peace. I felt a slightly less powerful sensation the following day. Same thing. I was gaming, minding my business, and I said in my mind, "Mum, if that's you, feel free to reach out." Suddenly, my dog runs into the room, gives me this really perplexed look, freezes and then ran away down the stairs, Scooby-Doo style. It was weird behavior for my dog to be sure, and it freaked me out a little if I'm honest. Not long after, I decided to honor my mother's wishes and track down a decent medium, kind of a screw it, let's see kind of thing. I began to ask around in subreddits on advice on this, and the medium approached me, and we had one session over the phone, and she pulled the word out of thin air. Imagine something as weird and specific as cherry coke or Wonder Bar. She mentioned many specifics around my mother's death as well, things she simply couldn't have known. For you skeptics, I don't blame you for your skepticism, because I was like you mere months ago. But understand that this woman approached me and refused to be paid for her services. We've since spoken again, and she has refused any kind of compensation. She's doing this to explore her own abilities, and has a full-time job in something else entirely. Understand, this was my default stance on mediums, that they are all full of crap, and I was well aware of cold readings and how it works. This woman was not in fact doing that. I've actually since paid a session from a different medium, and he was clearly applying cold reading techniques. It was completely different. With the experience in my house coupled with my medium interaction, what conclusion am I left with other than consciousness must persist after death in some way? Like I said, I can't prove this to anyone, but I assure you, I'm not lying. I had a friend who lived in an apartment complex just down the street from me. One day I decided to swing by. I knocked and he answered almost immediately. "Have a seat," he said casually. "I gotta use the bathroom." "Cool," I shrug, stepping inside and plopping down on the couch. The TV was already on, so I just zone out, flipping through channels. Minutes passed, then more, and after about 20 the front door swings open. There, standing in the doorway, was my friend, in his work uniform, keys still in hand, staring at me like I had just broken into his place. I frowned. "Bro, what did you do? Jump out the window?" His face was unreadable. "The hell are you talking about?" I laughed, still thinking he was messing with me. "You let me in? You said you had to take a dump?" His expression didn't change. "I wasn't here." "You were," I blinked. He shook his head, dead serious. "I only just got home." A weird silence settled between us and my stomach dropped. "You okay?" he asked, watching me closely. At that point I just muttered, "I'ma sit down," and did exactly that. For the rest of the night, he kept a subtle eye on me, half joking that he was making sure I wasn't tweaking, and at one point he even asked me to come closer so I can hear better while we were talking through it. He was obviously making sure that nothing was missing. We're still friends to this day, 20 years later, and he randomly brings up that night again. He wanted to double check if I still remembered it the same way, and I do. And to this day I have no explanation. Some dude let me into his apartment, and then that same dude came home from work 20 minutes later, completely unaware of it. After my dad passed, I struggled deeply with where he might be. I wanted so badly to believe he was at peace, but grief has a way of clouding faith. At the time, my family, my husband, our 2-year-old daughter and I were committed to going to church every Sunday. But that evening, the weight of my sorrow was just too much. I couldn't bring myself to go. My, now ex-husband, still wanted to attend. Since we only had one car, I drove him there and planned to pick him up later. The entire drive back home, my mind was consumed with silent prayers. I begged for some kind of sign, anything to reassure me that my dad was okay, and I had been keeping most of my grief inside, trying to hold together for my daughter. I wanted life to feel as normal as possible for her, so I wasn't outwardly falling apart. I sat quietly behind the wheel, engaging with her here and there, but mostly my thoughts were elsewhere, wrapped up in loss, in longing, and in desperate searching. Then out of nowhere, her little voice piped up from the back seat. "It's okay, Mama. Papa Fred's in heaven." I froze. For a second, I just responded automatically, something like, "I know, sweetheart," but my heart was racing. I hadn't been talking about my dad, I hadn't even been crying or mentioning his last name. She was only 2. How could she possibly know what to say? And then in the quiet I heard it, a voice not my own but something deep within me asking, "Did you hear me? I've given you the answer." And a wave of peace washed over me, so strong it nearly stole my breath. It didn't end my grief, not that day, not in the months coming, or even the years, but in that moment I knew my father was okay. He was home. I understand that not everyone believes in these things, and I know unfortunately that many Christians have given themselves a bad name by treating others with judgment instead of love. But for me it was a gift, a moment of grace when I needed it the most. When I shared this experience with fellow Christians, I was met with skepticism, dismissive remarks like, "That couldn't have happened." But I know what I heard, I know what I felt, and too often people choose to close themselves off to the unexplainable. I'm not sharing this to convince anyone, only to say that for me it was real. It was exactly what I needed to hear, and I hope in some small way it helps someone else find peace too. My childhood friend encountered a doppelganger. He was about 15 and home alone over a long weekend while his parents were traveling. But on Saturday night around 7 to 8, He was in his bedroom upstairs when he suddenly heard his mum call up the stairs to come get dinner. He popped his head out of his room, confused as hell, but no one was there. So he called back, "Mum, are you home already?" There was a long beat, but after a few seconds his mum slowly walked around the corner, coming from where the kitchen was, and looked straight up at him from the bottom of the stairs. She just smiled, then walked right back into the kitchen. My friend was frozen in place for a moment, but then again, he heard her call for him to come get dinner. He said the only reason he didn't just walk down those stairs to see what was going on and why she was home so early was because he thought it was strange that she didn't talk or utter a single word when she appeared. Like, why did she just smile at him and walk away? That just didn't sit right. He could hear her and could see her both plain as day, but never at the same time. And that smallest of details is why he chose to slam his door, lock it, and call his mum. She answered immediately, and was still several states over, hundreds of miles away. They ended up calling the police for fear of an intruder or something, but they never found anyone in the house. It was all locked up with the security system on and everything. He didn't sleep alone there after that. I don't know what the answer here is, but if it happens to you, don't instantly assume you're crazy. My grandfather was already dead for a while when my grandma needed to move into a senior home. In our country, you have to pay for those facilities by yourself, supported by government insurance. If you run out of money and your insurance is too low, which it'll be, trust me, the state pays the difference. However, for this, you need to prove that you didn't waste or give your money away. Knowing the time frame for government checks, I withdrew a large sum of money, still leaving 6 digits from her account, so it wouldn't show on the X years record because her money would last for X plus years, and this way she could still either get some fancy extras like her weekly hairdresser, or I could use it as inheritance or a gift to my younger sister for her wedding. A few days after I took the money, I went to visit her and wanted to tell her about it. Before I could say anything though, she started telling me that she had been having dreams about being at the bank with my grandpa, telling her their money is gone. She never before and never after told me about any dreams of my grandpa, and my grandma had no idea of her money. It was always either my grandpa and then later me taking care of all the finances. She had no access to the account other than her debit card. Unfortunately, my grandma passed away before she could spend her money on weekly blowouts or the things she liked. I made sure she was buried with my grandpa, throwing sand from the beach they had visited for decades in their grave. I also made sure that my sister got twice the sum I took out of the account from the inheritance. Also, Grandpa, excuse me? I'm a sly character, but it wasn't that bad, it being far away from being all the money. He was just looking out for his girl, the way he always had. I wonder if that's proof of there being something after death. This happened 1.5 years ago, and I still think about it constantly. I was in the woods with 2 friends sitting in a car. It wasn't a remote area, just off the side of the road near a one-way tunnel. A train ran above the tunnel, and it was one of those small ones where you needed to honk before driving through. The area was surrounded by woods and farmland. We were chatting when my friend Susan suddenly said, "There's something moving over there," and pointed towards the trees. I heard movement too, and when I glanced over I expected to see a squirrel or something small. Instead, all 3 of us saw a human-like figure moving towards us from within the trees. Our windows were rolled down, and as soon as we acknowledged it with a collective, "What the hell is that?" it stopped. At first I thought it might have been a person, maybe someone walking around or even a homeless person. But this wasn't an area where people just wandered, and our town is so small that we knew only 2 homeless people, and it definitely wasn't one of them. I might have dismissed it as a person if not for one eerie detail. It had no mouth. All three of us saw the same thing. We're not paranormal people, but this was something we couldn't explain. The figure was human-shaped, but shrouded in darkness. I know it sounds strange, but it didn't have clear edges, almost like it fully didn't exist in our space. It wasn't transparent or translucent, but there was something about it that seemed unreal. It had no mouth, but we saw its eyes. As soon as we noticed it, the figure stopped moving. Then, without warning, it turned around and walked back into the woods and vanished. It didn't just fade into the distance, it vanished. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I'm naturally a skeptical person, but we all saw the same thing. We got the hell out of there immediately, and to this day the three of us still talk about it. I should mention we all felt strange even before seeing it. About half an hour earlier, we'd all acknowledged feeling a deep sense of paranoia and anxiety that we couldn't explain. I'll be honest, we were smoking a joint, but I don't think that would have caused us to see the same thing. Many years ago, my mother saw her grandfather's apparition approach via the walkway to the front door of his home. Family was gathering at his house to celebrate his passing. My mum, a young girl at the time, was looking at the family room window towards the front yard and saw him clearly. Fast forward, I accurately described to my mother how he walked, what he was wearing, and she said it was his favorite shirt. How do I know? I remember being with him at that moment. I also remember being with him and dying in his bathroom, trying to conceal my cause of death from my family by busying myself shaving or drawing a bath, and making it seem like some sudden event, when really I had been sick for months and hiding it. I remember entertaining my family with party tricks like walking on my hands or down a flight of stairs. I remember being someone else, entirely after his death, and before my current incarnation, and how and why I died. I remember that moment of death clearly. I remember much older incarnations. I remember telling my childhood friends that I died in the American Civil War, and they laughed at me, but I still remember that moment fairly well too. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope this was as thought-provoking and interesting for you as it was for me. A truly touching collection of stories and accounts. I'd love to get your thoughts and opinions in the comments, so feel free to meet me there. If there's anything you want to discuss or share, who knows, maybe even material for a video in the future. I look forward to hearing from many of you. I'd like to wrap up by giving a huge thank you, as always, to my members and my patrons, whose names can be seen on screen now. If you would like to get some cool perks, which today includes some exclusive alien stories, alien and UFO should I say, you can follow the link in the description to find out more. Obviously, financial contributions are incredibly appreciated, but of course unnecessary. Until then, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.